Hi, this is Krista Curran, and I'd like to welcome you to our presentation today about the new mCLASS that will be released this fall for next school year. Just before we get started, a few items. We are recording this webinar, so we will be able to share this out with you so you can share it with other teammates after this webinar is complete. If you are having any technical difficulties, please let us know in the questions panel, and we will try to address those for you. Also, when in doubt, reboot, so you could shut down your browser and try restarting the Zoom application. And please do send us your questions throughout the webinar. There's a Q&A section within Zoom where you can share some questions, and we will answer those at the end of the session. So again, just to introduce the presenters, I'm Krista Curran. I work on mCLASS at Amplify, and we are pleased to be joined by Dr. Gina Biancarosa, who comes to us from the University of Oregon, was deeply involved in the development of DIBELS 8th edition, which is part of the new mCLASS platform that we'll be launching next school year. And she's an associate professor and Ann Swindells chair in education there at the University of Oregon. And then we have Alan Stadmauer, who is our executive director of literacy at Amplify. And I think I'm going to, today we're going to cover what is mCLASS, how we cover screening and progress monitoring for literacy using the new DIBELS 8th edition, how mCLASS, what the new reporting and instructional tools will look like for mCLASS next school year, talk about both assessment administration, some of the other things that we provide, like the reports and parent letters to share information with parents about how their children are progressing in their literacy development, and how we support teachers with providing instant targeted instruction. And then we'll wrap up by talking about professional learning options and support and some costs associated with using mCLASS with DIBELS 8th edition. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Alan.
Hi, everybody. This is Alan Stadmauer, Executive Director of Literacy. And firstly, before we start talking a little bit about mCLASS, you should see a poll. We'd love to know more about why you joined us here today. What are you curious about, as well as what you're currently using for assessment. So you should see that popping up at some point on your screen. Please, as we go along, just complete the simple 2-question poll. So to introduce mCLASS before we take a deep dive into DIBELS 8th itself, Amplify is a K-8 curriculum and assessment company that provides both science and ELA curricula, as well as early literacy and math assessments. The early literacy assessments that we're talking about today, mCLASS with DIBELS, has been around since the year 2000 when the company was initially founded. So we are extremely laser focused on literacy and partnering with districts and schools who really want to move the needle for their early readers and for their struggling readers at any level in K through 6. Till now, we've served about 14 million students. So this is both a platform as well as an assessment that has withstood this test of time. Each time that the University of Oregon has updated the DIBELS assessment, we've also used the opportunity to completely refresh the mCLASS mobile delivery of that assessment. So we're on the verge of releasing the new mCLASS with DIBELS 8th, and that's what I hope that we get a chance to talk about today. In a nutshell, mCLASS is a complete assessment, instruction, and intervention solution with DIBELS at its heart. But it also serves as both a universal screener and a dyslexia screener. DIBELS provides the classic foundational early literacy skills. But a few years ago, we really came to understand the wave of legislation, the wave of interest, even when there isn't statewide legislation, in screening students for the risk of dyslexia, as well as understanding how valuable it is to catch that really early. So Amplify added to the DIBELS measures spelling, vocabulary, and rapid automatized naming. We won't be talking about those measures today, but please do reach out to us or ask questions in the Q&A box about that if you're curious. So when we look at mCLASS Suite as a whole, we have the assessment administration in both an observational or teacher-administered version as well as a computer-administered version. We have the classic data and reporting tools, but most importantly, and I think this is where we'll focus later on when we come to understand D8, is how it can drive powerful approaches to instruction with teacher-led lessons. We also offer intervention and a student on a device, student-driven adaptive curriculum. Now, in terms of how mCLASS we administer the assessments themselves, mCLASS is a developmentally appropriate administration. What we mean by that is in K1, it's teacher and students sitting side by side, teacher administered. The teacher has a device so that way they can score, and the child has in front of her a printed kit that has all of the items in front of her, because we believe that especially at these grades, it's so important for a teacher to see and hear with her own eyes how a student is hearing sounds, attacking words, reading fluently, and not only being able to score that digitally, but also develop a holistic understanding of how that child is doing, and also what was their affect at the moment in which they're taking the assessment. For the older students, for the ones who are on benchmark, we do offer online benchmark administration that the students can sit on their own device. It does save some time, though even then we do recommend that students who are below proficiency, teachers still administer it directly. Now, DIBELS 8 offers a lot of advantages over all prior versions of DIBELS in terms of being able to do more diagnostic data in less time. And with that, I'd love to turn things over to Gina from the University of Oregon to really walk us through the great new improvements in DIBELS 8th edition.
Hi there, just give me a second to share my screen. Great. So hopefully you can see a slide that says, what is DIBELS 8th edition? And that is what I will be talking to you about. If you are familiar with DIBELS at all, DIBELS 8th edition really continues the tradition of DIBELS, but it expands on, refines, and improves on that edition or previous editions. So DIBELS 8th edition, there are a number of things that really informed our development of this latest edition of DIBELS. One is that, you know, as we know, education is sort of a perennially politically hot topic, and there are constantly different kinds of changes in the trends and educational priorities, standards, and expectations. And in order to best equip teachers with the information that will help them to meet standards, we need to have our assessments keep pace with those changes. There have also historically been a number of critiques of curriculum-based measures, and our development process was responsive to those. We also are applying advances that have come forth in measurement science in the last decade since the last version of DIBELS came out, as well as we have kept in mind that the rigor of standards for the technical adequacy of screening and progress monitoring measures has also been increasing, and so we want to, again, keep pace with the field. And then finally, nationwide, there's been a very strong movement. There are over 40 states at this point that have some form of dyslexia legislation. And in many states, as a response to this legislation, schools are beginning to use CBMs like DIBELS as dyslexia screeners. And so we wanted to take that unplanned use of CBMs into account as we developed the newer version of DIBELS. So DIBELS has been available from kindergarten through 6th grade. And one of the things that we've done is we have extended the availability of DIBELS into 7th and 8th grade so that you can screen and progress monitor your students all the way through middle school. Also sort of highlighted in the yellow here are places where we extended measures up or down in a grade level. And that's in response to requests from teachers and administrators to have the same subtest available throughout a grade rather than just at certain time points within a grade. Finally, we've added a new measure called Sight Word Reading Fluency, or WRF, and this assessment, as I'll explain, helps to kind of further refine the safety net that we have with DIBELS. In addition to adding things to DIBELS, we also wanted to maintain the efficiency of the DIBELS assessment system, and so we really paid attention to ways that we can minimize assessment time. So one of the biggest improvements for those familiar with DIBELS is we used to require 3 passages be given at each benchmark period, beginning, middle, and end of year, and we now only require 1 passage. So that's a savings of 2/3 of the time that you would normally spend on an oral reading fluency benchmark assessment. In addition, because we've extended the availability of certain subtests throughout grades, especially in the early grades, we have come up with new rules regarding when we might discontinue assessment. So we've always had discontinue rules for specific subtests. If a student doesn't perform to a certain level within a certain minimal amount of time, we discontinue that subtest, but traditionally we've continued on to the next subtest. We now have rules that are based on research that we did the last academic year that suggest that at a certain point with a certain measure, if a student gets a score of 0, it's really unnecessary to give them the higher level measures because the likelihood that they'll be able to do anything on those measures is very, very small. We've also come up with rules that allow you to kind of discontinue in the opposite direction. So in later grades, we are recommending that assessment begin with the more advanced skills, and then depending on student performance, you may or may not give the more foundational skill measures. And then finally, if you are using Amplify's mCLASS platform, the tablet administration also results in time savings simply because it saves you the effort of shuffling paper and starting and stopping timers. So I'm going to talk about each of the subtests now in turn, and I'll start with phonemic segmentation fluency. So phonemic segmentation fluency is a measure that gets at phonological awareness and a particular aspect of phonological awareness that develops very rapidly across kindergarten and 1st grade. As you're probably aware, phonemic awareness is a key sort of foundational knowledge source that goes into our ability to read. So in phonemic segmentation fluency, we ask students to read or to segment, progressively longer words. So we begin with 2 phoneme words and move on to 3 and 4 and so on. And students are asked to segment as many of those words as they can within a minute. The forms increase in difficulty, as I was saying, in terms of the number of phonemes they represent. They also increase in difficulty between kindergarten and 1st grade. We also offer a measure called letter naming fluency. With letter naming fluency, what we are doing is looking at not just letter name knowledge, but the efficiency of that knowledge, how automatic that knowledge is. And because of dyslexia legislation in many states, there are schools and districts that are using letter naming fluency as a measure of processing speed. And because that practice seems to be becoming more widespread, in our revisions to letter naming fluency for the 8th edition, we paid attention to that usage. And as a result, we dropped the capital and lowercase w and the lowercase l. In brief, W takes 3 syllables to name, whereas every other letter in the English language only takes 1. So it sort of interferes, depending on where it appears in a form, with the amount of time a student actually has. So not that W isn't an important letter, but we know that you have other ways of assessing sort of whether students know the letter W or not. So when it comes to fluency, we wanted to kind of level the playing field. In terms of the lowercase l, it's sort of a simple question of, in most fonts, lowercase l can look a lot like a capital I, and in all fonts that we were able to locate, the lowercase l looks like the number 1. So that causes confusion for children as well as for test administrators, and as a result, we dropped L. We also have a measure of nonsense word fluency. A lot of people question why we use nonsense words. And really one of the key things to keep in mind is that when a student is decoding a new text and comes across an unknown word, that word really starts off as a nonsense word for them until they've decoded it and been able to sort of recognize, oh, this is a word I know, and here's the meaning that goes with it. So by using nonsense words, we're really forcing kids to demonstrate their ability to take on that decoding task. Nonsense word fluency used to just be a kindergarten and first grade measure. We've extended it through 3rd grade, and the spelling patterns that we assess, in the past, nonsense word fluency has included illegal spelling patterns. That is no longer the case, so they will look for all intents and purposes like possible words in the English language, therefore it will be a little bit more authentic of a measure than it's been in the past. The forms increase in difficulty across items within a form, and then across the grades they also can increase in difficulty. So whereas in kindergarten students only see closed syllable words, VC and CVC, in 1st grade we begin to introduce silent E words, R-controlled vowels, consonant blends and digraphs. In 2nd grade, we include all of the above, but also introduce vowel digraphs and 2-syllable words. And finally, in 3rd grade, those 2-syllable words begin to become even more complex with potentially multiple consonant blends within them. So the way this looks on a form, this is a template for the development of a 1st grade form. And you can see that up to the first horizontal line, we've got CVC and VC words. And importantly, because the primary use of DIBELS measures is for detecting students at risk for not meeting end-of-year learning goals, it's important that the cut score for a particular form represents skills that should be pretty solidified within a grade. So in 1st grade, the cut score appears within the closed syllable pattern, and we only get into those more complex patterns, which are frankly taught later in the year until we've gotten past the risk designation. And so in this way, we're able to detect risk with very good accuracy, while also yielding information for teachers about the more advanced spelling patterns that students may or may not know yet. So for the word reading fluency measure, this is a new measure to DIBELS. And in the past, I think the thought was if students could decode, they were well on their way to literacy and we were good to go. But as we know, there's a long-standing tradition of research that shows that there are dual routes to literacy, and that in addition to learning how to decode novel words, children also know certain words by sight. In large part because some words are simply not as decodable or phonically regular as others, but also because some words are just seen so frequently in print that they simply become sight words that are known automatically without sounding them out. And there's a great deal of research suggesting that this knowledge is an important predictor of reading skill. So we introduced this measure. It occurs in kindergarten through 3rd grade. And as with the other subtests that I've talked about, the forms have items that increase in difficulty, and then the difficulty also increases across the grades. And this is in terms of the number of syllables in words, as you can see from the sample words here, as well as the frequency with which words appear in the English language. In determining the words that appear in WRF, we really wanted to take word frequency into account. So we began with the Dale and O'Rourke list, which is kind of a classic. But we also didn't want to rely on a single list in terms of determining our item pool, because each of the word lists that are out there have certain drawbacks. And they only agree necessarily on some words, not all of them, in terms of how frequent they are or how well known they are. So in order to be included in our item pool, words had to appear on the Dale and O'Rourke list, and they had to be known by 50% or more of 4th grade students. So words that aren't typically acquired by 4th grade were simply thrown out. We also then looked at research by Andrew Biemiller and his colleagues, where they also had adults rate age of acquisition. And these ratings actually correlate very well with the test-based work that Dale and O'Rourke did. So we were able to use that to then narrow down the pools for 3rd grade, 2nd grade, 1st grade, and kindergarten in terms of when words are typically known in a particular grade. The frequency ratings came from 2 different very large corpora. And basically a word had to be very frequent on both of these lists in order to be included in the pool. So if it only appeared on one, we dropped it. And then of course we dropped words with at least one potentially inappropriate meaning, or that were slang or what have you. So we ended up with a total pool of 2,000 words for grade 3, and those pools get progressively smaller once we start taking into account the word knowledge and frequency restrictions that we imposed for lower and lower grades. The one question that does come up is why we would have both nonsense word fluency and word reading fluency when most CBMs have either one or the other. And these graphs that you're looking at help to display that. So on the x-axis, what we have is one of the nonsense word fluency scores here, the correct number of letter sounds in a minute. And on the y-axis, we have word reading fluency scores. Scores here, children only get credit if they read, excuse me, the whole word as a whole. And so that is the number of words read within a minute. And we have kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, and 3rd grade. And this comes from data that we collected last year. And what we see is that the children in the purple are children that both measures see as on track. They're predicted to do quite, or essentially meet grade level expectations by the end of the year. The children in the red are children that both measures are identifying as children at risk for not meeting end of grade expectations. And importantly, the addition of WRF allows us to detect these green kids. These are children who are actually able to decode pretty well, and this is on our more advanced NWF measure. And so you can see that many of these children are naming as many as 100 correct letter sounds in a minute, and yet they're not able to read as many as 50 real words in a minute. So there's a real disconnect between their decoding ability and their sight word knowledge. And so these are students for whom sight word knowledge is not as strong as we would like it to be, and it indicates risk, again, for not meeting end of grade goals. There are also students who can be missed if we're only using NWF, who show pretty extreme patterns. And they're unusual cases, but they're important to catch as early as we possibly can. Here's a student who's reading or able to decode over 150 correct letter sounds in a minute, and yet again can't even meet a benchmark of 50 correct words in a minute. Of course, if we only used word reading fluency, though, we would be missing the children in turquoise, because these are children who are sort of over the cut score in that horizontal line for word reading fluency, but are under the cut score for nonsense word fluency. So these children are showing the opposite pattern. They are not good decoders, but they know a lot of words by sight. So again, that helps to inform not only who we determine as at risk, but also the type of instruction we provide them. Moving on to oral reading fluency, as I mentioned, we only administer one passage now at each benchmark period. Importantly, all of the passages have now been written by published and aspiring authors. As a result, the passages are a lot more engaging and read a lot more authentic than they have in the past. In addition, all of the passages have been reviewed by a panel of parents and former classroom teachers. They were rating not only for the grade appropriateness of the content of the passage and the language and the word selection, but also around text complexity. And so that helped us to assign passages to grade levels, taking not only readability, but also text complexity into account. MAIS is our reading comprehension measure, and it followed the same development procedures as ORF. So again, written by published and aspiring authors and reviewed by a panel of teachers and parents. In addition, we revised a few things around the formatting. So line lengths are now grade appropriate, as is font size. And our selection of distractor items is now informed by the research so that we can better have MAIS predict reading comprehension or higher levels of reading comprehension than it may have done in the past. Beyond all of this, without going too much into it, we paid a lot of attention to the fonts we used and the font sizes, again, referring to research to guide our decisions. We also will be offering equated ORF and MAIS benchmark forms, and the remaining subtests benchmark forms should be equated by the end of this calendar year. And we're also equating all of the progress monitoring forms. And what this means is that those sort of known differences between forms in terms of difficulty will be taken care of for progress monitoring so that we can account for how difficult or easy a passage is. We also have done zones of growth analyses that will help with both planning and sort of goal setting, as well as progress monitoring. And we will have composite scores as well. We do have composite scores. We're just finalizing cut scores on those. So the few takeaways I'd like you to have from all of this are that we put a lot of care into how we developed the different subtests, how we developed our item pools, and even to the point of how we place those items on forms. And this has resulted in more strictly comparable forms than ever before. Equating further helps us improve equivalence of forms, especially for ORF and MAIS. And the progressive difficulty that occurs on all of our list measures ultimately provides data on skills for all learners without sacrificing the efficiency and information of the screening validity purpose. So I'll also briefly go through the evidence for DIBELS 8th edition. This is really a high-level summary, and if you would like more detail, we can obviously provide that. The point here, I'll start here. So we have two validation studies, one that was completed last year, one that is literally just about to wrap up right now. And across these two studies, We have over 10,000 students in grades kindergarten through 8th grade, and they come from over 40 schools in, I believe, when you look at the states across the two studies, it's over half of the states in the US. These states represent all of the census regions as well as different locales. It is a racially and ethnically diverse sample. Only about 60% of the students are white, which reflects the changing demographics of the US. Over 50% are in free and reduced meals, again, reflecting the current state of the US. And we have administered multiple criterion measures, which are the measures we try to predict at the end of the year. We have predicted the DIBELS Next Composite Score, 2 different IO assessment reading tests, their word analysis and reading tests, and also the comprehensive test of phonological processing, specifically included so that we can address and validate the use of CBMs, specifically DIBELS 8th edition, as dyslexia screeners. So the big takeaway for our technical adequacy is that the evidence is, first of all, more bountiful than it's ever been. We have more evidence on each of the measures, and that evidence is as good as or even stronger than any previous DIBELS edition. So in terms of reliability, our alternate form reliability is excellent, ranging from a low of 0.81 to a high of 0.95. The one exception is maize, where that alternate form reliability is a little bit lower, but that's fairly typical for maize measures in general. Test-retest reliability is also very good, ranging from a low of 0.72 to a high of 0.92. And I would point out that this is despite the fact that there 2 to 3 months had elapsed between test and retest with the same form. So that's actually stronger evidence than you would normally see for that. Concurrent and predictive validity correlations are all very good, generally at 0.5 or above. And better yet, our composite scores have correlations that are considered very strong at 0.7 or above. I'll just talk for a minute about screening accuracy before I turn things back over to Alan. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this image, when we think about screening and measures that are used for screening, we want to judge the risk status as identified by the measure against sort of reality. Here, reality is reading difficulty as determined by a gold standard assessment. And in the vast majority of our analyses, that's the Iowa test of reading. In kindergarten, we actually use the DIBELS Next composite scores. And what we want to do when we're doing this is we look at 3 statistics. One is the area under the curve, which is a sort of generic statistic or an overarching statistic that tells you how good a measure is doing at screening across different ways you might look at it. But we're also particularly interested in 2 ways of looking at it. And one is sensitivity, which is the true positive rate. It's the percentage of students that a measure identifies as at risk who are actually experiencing difficulty at the end of the year. The other thing we're interested in is specificity, which reflects the true negative rate. And this is the degree to which our measures correctly identify students as not at risk when, in fact, at the end of the year, they don't exhibit any difficulty in reading. And the idea is that for all 3 of these numbers, the closer they are to 1, the better a measure is doing at these things. So when we look at the evidence for DIBELS 8th edition, and I've only shown you a sampling here for kindergarten and 1st grade, these numbers are all approaching 1, which is exactly what you want to see. In general, as a standard, people are looking for 0.8 or better, and you can see that we largely have that. The first number here is the AUC, so that's that global measure of how good a job a measure is doing. The next measure is sensitivity, our correct sort of at-risk designation, and then the final number in the parenthesis is specificity, the correct not at risk designation. And so these are reports for each of our subtests within these grades. We also have begun the analyses on the composite scores, and needless to say, because they pull in these disparate measures, the evidence so far is looking even better. So the evidence here is that we're actually doing a much better job than we've ever done in the past in terms of accurately identifying students both as at risk and not at risk. So I guess the last thing I would urge you to take away from this is that we're not also resting on these laurels. There are a number of analyses I wasn't able to present today regarding the equating work, our composite scores, and the zones of growth. But this study that I mentioned that's being completed now, based on this, we're going to be able to additionally equate benchmark forms for the other subtests. We are gathering more validation data around the dyslexia screening use. We will have additional evidence for validating Maze and our composite scores. And we will be able to provide evidence around the reliability and validity of slopes for when children are assessed over time. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Gina, for going through literally measure by measure, not only what each of the DIBELS 8th measures is assessing, but what is new about it. I'd like to invite the audience, everybody please, I'm sure you have many questions based upon what Gina is raising. Please put them in the Q&A box. You'll see it at the bottom of your screens. You can click on that and ask us as many questions as you can while I continue to talk about what DIBELS 8th looks and feels like in mCLASS. So first of all, when we think about the question of what does it take to screen a classroom full of students, what we see here again is how you look at which measures are available from K all the way through 6. For those of you who are used to using older versions of DIBELS, one of the really interesting enhancements is that if a measure is available during the year, it's available for beginning, middle, and end of year for that year. So for example, a teacher can always tell in kindergarten beginning, middle, and end of year scores on letter naming fluency. It doesn't sunset in the middle of first grade. So you can always do apples to apples measures. If we look down the chart, we could see that in a one-to-one administration of, as I call them, mostly 1-minute measures, it takes about, say, 5 minutes per child in kindergarten, about 6 minutes in grade 1. In 2 through 6, you save a little bit of time because the reading comprehension of Maze is actually administered online for everybody. Now, this represents a pretty significant time savings versus DIBELS Next. By the time that you're hitting 2, 3, grades 4 through 6, you might be saving 4 to 6 minutes per child per administration. Now, as we begin to see what this looks like in mCLASS, let me go back and give a high-level understanding of this now that we understand more deeply each of these measures. So, my apologies about that. So once again, to set the stage, we have Mrs. MacArthur is getting ready to assess her student, Emma Ashley. I'll show you what that looks like in the new version, but to set the stage, Emma has in front of her the items that she'll read. Say, for example, in our case study of nonsense word fluency, she'll have the list of non-words. Mrs. MacArthur, on the other hand, has in front of her a tablet or a Chromebook, ideally something with a touch screen in which she'll be able to score. As Gina walked us through, the forms themselves really hit a very wide range of patterns in order to be able to get deep diagnostic data for all students. So what we see here is how in the kindergarten form, we've got CVC words. In grade 1, that moves very quickly from the CVC to more complex patterns. In 2nd grade, the most struggling students still have the opportunity to show what they know on the CVC words, though they might get stuck a little bit further. The just below proficiency or at proficiency or well above, they're going to hit harder and harder words as they go along. And then we see the same thing happening in grade 3. So the question is, what do we do with that? It's not just about measuring the scores, but mCLASS is going to be able to analyze the reading patterns and actually recommend groups. We'll see this in just a moment, where we could see which students not only can decode, but what they are able to do or what they need to work on is reading words with R-controlled spelling patterns. At the same time, we'll instantaneously have results across all the foundational skills and a composite score for every child. And you use the exact same tool to progress monitor. Obviously, for progress monitoring, you don't do all of the measures, but it will be done the exact same way as I'll show you momentarily. But in this case, the mCLASS will recommend which progress monitoring measures should be administered for a particular child who's running below benchmark. And sometimes that's even going to be a grade below. So you may have a 3rd grade student who's really struggling with oral reading fluency, and perhaps mCLASS will make the suggestion to progress monitor with the 2nd grade oral reading fluency form, or maybe even a decoding form from 2nd grade, so that we can make sure that we're pinpointing on the progress monitoring, not just how they're responding to instruction, but also being able to collect new, very granular data around the reading patterns of each of these students. Now let's take a look at what that looks like. So first, coming back to administration. Mrs. MacArthur is about to administer mCLASS to her class, and she has in front of her Emma Ashley. So she could see all of her students' scores are the ones that she's completed, and she's about to continue her work assessing Emma. As we can see here, it's middle of year. Some of the measures have already been administered, and mCLASS will indicate with the blue box that now you're up to NWF, nonsense word fluency. Mrs. MacArthur can see on her screen simple, straightforward reminders on how to do this with fidelity, and then literally how to walk Emma through her instructions. Mr. Say guides exactly what to say so that every student has the exact same instructions in front of them. And then we move on to the measure after a practice item. On the screen, there'll be a 1-minute timer counting up to the end of the measure. And then Mrs. MacArthur can see the word that Emma has in front of her on her kit, or rab. As Emma reads it, maybe she says, b. And Mrs. MacArthur will tap under the R, under the A, under the B. If then she blends it into rab, draw a line underneath it. Exactly however Emma says it, that's what we do in mCLASS. So it could be ra, rab. And then it's line, line, line. Moving on to the next word. And then finally, we're going to hit, this system will stop Mrs. MacArthur at the end of the minute. We can always invalidate the probe if it turns out that Emma was highly distracted, but most of the time, the assessment was done well and it was done with fidelity. And we have an instant scoring of the measure right here. Since this is the last measure, not only do we have the composite score here, but we have a real opportunity for teachers and students. Every child says, how did I do, how did I do, how did I do? And by clicking on the running girl, we can see how Emma did since the beginning of the year on each of these different measures. This usually becomes a great opportunity for teachers and students to have a conversation and truly empowered student-centered learning. As Mrs. MacArthur wants to see her deeper results, she'll come back to the platform, to mCLASS home portal, and see her report. Firstly, a quick summary of the whole class. You may notice that I'm working from designs. The designers mapped out almost everything being equal, but of course we know that there's not a single classroom in America that wouldn't have some hotspot here. You need to do more work on decoding, or everybody got the decoding, stop beating a dead horse, move along with your whole class instruction. But of course, teachers want to know, where are my students? How are they doing? And simple, easy to see, easy to digest, scores against the foundational literacy skills, sortable for each by student, by scores, by skill, and can drill deeper down to actually see, how did Emma read a passage, the full transcript. Now, Mrs. MacArthur may not want to do this for every student. That would be rather time consuming, but we do know that in data meetings or where there's a handoff, or maybe you're wondering about Emma's results, maybe it feels like a little bit different from what was happening in the classroom. This is a good opportunity, not always to trust what the system is telling you, but really complete transparency with teachers where they can get to see what was going on. Full historical information is available as well. We can look back to the prior year or years on every single measure. Now, what really will matter to Mrs. MacArthur is what's happening at the detailed reading patterns of Emma, what's surfaced below the level of decoding. Well, she has difficulties with final letters. What mCLASS will next do is take for each student and suggest that they should be in a group. This is not Emma's group per se, but it's a group of 6 students in the class who need more work on letter combinations. In plain English, mCLASS will suggest teach consonant, digress, and variant vowel patterns. We'll see the group's reading patterns in clear language and have teacher-led instruction, instant targeted work that could be done with that group by the teacher during small group time. Of course, they may want to go back to their core curriculum, but this is stuff that they could use that's highly targeted, on track, low prep, and instant. We do offer Amplify Reading as a student on a device, adaptive program in a game-like environment where students can practice on their own, and a 30-minute connected intervention, 30-minute a day connected intervention, should you want it for the students who are most struggling. But these groupings are really what's critical for teachers. Now, mind you, this happens even with progress monitoring data. So the groupings are very, very dynamic. As I mentioned earlier, you progress monitor using the exact same tool in the exact same way. You see each student's progress towards their benchmarks over their last progress monitoring, and they're being put in groups with the analysis of their underlying reading subskills. So as a complete solution, what we're able to see here is how Mrs. MacArthur is able to assess, quickly read and interpret her data, identify her priorities for the whole class, see the underlying reading patterns and skills below the subskill level for each individual student, for groups of students, and has a complete set of targeted instruction that can be provided to them. Letters home that can either be mailed out in English and Spanish or used for parent-teacher conferences. And of course, you or reading coaches in your school or principals might find a lot of value in the reporting and analytics suite, which gives you the chance to compare classes, compare year over year, who are all of my students who are struggling with decoding. Are we even monitoring with fidelity and progress monitoring at the right rate? So each of these reports offers all the slice and dice filters that you would ever want, as well as the ability to download the data so you could bring it up in your own reporting system and import it into other systems you may have that you may have as well. So again, what we've seen here is a very, very broad assessment, instruction, and intervention solution. But we don't just leave you there to figure it all out for yourself. Of course, we have PD. Typically, we recommend 2 days for a real gold standards, in-depth understanding of each of the measures and what it does and what it means instructionally, and a lot of practice. This can also be done in a day. We offer this on-site, remote, or have fully asynchronous online courses. But we do offer you deeper opportunities for professional learning where you can strengthen, go further into progress monitoring, further into the reporting and analytics suite, as well as there is customer care will answer not only technical support questions, but we have a whole team of career educators who can answer pedagogy questions. Can you look at my data and help me understand what to do next with my class? And they love getting deep in the weeds with teachers who give them a call about really how to use this data. So again, we are gonna take questions in a moment. So we're looking for questions in the chat box and in the Q&A panel. But lastly, to give you a high level Our cost structure, please ask us about this. We can send you out a quote, email us, we'll get you in touch with your own account executive. The annual costs are licensing fees. The one-time costs are for the printed kits that I mentioned and for your initial professional development. As you can see, the licenses include basically everything I listed out there in the Ginsu knife style, the assessments, the instruction, the progress monitoring, dyslexia screening if you want, the grouping and the teacher-led lessons. And of course, we also have available the intervention and Amplify reading. I would like to point out, I know that a number of you have indicated in your polls that you are doing guided reading. We can add for you the text reading and comprehension measure, or TRC, which basically mimics a guided reading in the same way the student has a book, the teacher has a device, and by moving through the TRC measure, you can get a very accurate and valid instructional reading level. We do also offer for K3 a similar idea of a teacher-administered assessment in math, and we also do have literacy for Spanish. With that, as you can see, we've got this universal screening tool, dyslexia screening tool, great data, great instruction, and most importantly, deeply, deeply time-tested. So it's a new version built on more than 3 decades of research and 14 million students doing this. So with that, I'd like to turn the floor back to Krista to take your questions.
Sure, Ellen. The first question that I have, somebody's asking, one passage for ORF sounds great, but how can one passage be as good as 3? I don't know, Gina, do you want to try to take that? And Ellen, you can chime in. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question. So basically, when we administered 3 passages in the past, we would only use the data from one of those passages, and it was the median passage. So the child read one passage slower than the other 2 and another one faster than the other 2. We took the middle one. There's been research in the last decade conducted, some of it here at the University of Oregon, but also by others outside of the University of Oregon. And it has repeatedly shown that if we were to use other practices, such as maybe averaging across the 3, or simply using the first, second, or third of the passages, that they're all equally predictive. So the relationship between oral reading fluency and the measures and performances that we're trying to predict using that are just as good, whatever method we use. And so given that instructional time is at such a premium, and our children are already being assessed more than many people like, we thought it was worthy of reducing the number of passages. So there is research to demonstrate that we're not sacrificing any precision in our measurement system when we do that.
Thanks, Gina. Certainly the time saving is welcome improvement as well. The next question, Alan, I think you can take this one. Somebody is asking if they said they use our intervention program, Burst Intervention. They want to understand whether that's going to work with the new DIBELS 8th edition.
Yes. The Burst Intervention program is getting updated along with the rest of the platform, and it will be driven by DIBELS 8 data as well as DIBELS 8 progress monitoring. Thank you for asking that. We hope that you're actually enjoying the current version as well.
Great. And there's another question about, are the assessment materials available now? And so, Gina, you might want to add to this. I can just say that on the University of Oregon's website, you can download the DIBELS 8th edition materials free of charge. And then Amplify, as we do now for other versions, we'll be offering kits for purchase as well if you're interested in purchasing those kits for your teachers. Okay, we have, Oh,
Oh,
go ahead.
sorry. I was just going
Yeah.
to say, in addition to the measures themselves, there's also a technical report that you can download if you have questions about some of the technical adequacy of evidence I was presenting.
Great. We have another question coming in. The question is, are goals set based off of one grade level worth of growth?
That's actually a great question. In order to do that, you first have to define what one grade's worth of growth looks like. And what really any of the systems that do that do is they first set some sort of criterion for what students ought to know by the end of the year, or how they ought to be able to perform on a reading task. And then what we do is look at how kids come in and then kind of calculate basically what is the average growth over the course of that year. We certainly do that, but what we do with our zones of growth analysis is we kind of take it one step further, and we look at what average growth is depending on where a child comes in. Because as many of us know, students who come in with less under their belts have a lot more that they can gain during the academic year, whereas children who kind of come in with, every now and then there's that kindergartner who walks in the door who's already reading, that student is obviously not going to show the same sort of growth that a child who comes in who doesn't know their letters might show during a kindergarten year. And so what the zones of growth does is it basically says, based on where a child comes in, what's average growth, what's a typical year's worth of growth, as well as what's below and above average, and well below and well above average as well.
Thanks, Gina. Okay, well, I think that's all of the questions that we have from the attendees. We'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us. And please, if you have questions that we haven't been able to answer here or that come up after you see this, please email us at help@amplify.com and somebody will be able to respond to you. And we look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you very much.